This is Judaism Unbound, episode 474, Israel-Palestine, Jewish Diasporism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're returning to our series of episodes exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. Our guests today, Alissa Wise and Andrue Kahn, are two rabbis who have been activists toward an enduring ceasefire in Israel-Palestine. Alissa Wise is the founder of a new project called Rabbis for Ceasefire, and Andrue Kahn has reinvigorated a long-standing project that has been relatively dormant in recent years called the American Council for Judaism. We're going to explore the role of a rabbi in a time like this, and we'll learn about the work of the two organizations that our guests lead, along with how these organizations tie into broader emerging work around the framework of diasporism, which is a term that's gaining currency these days, and it can be defined in lots of different ways, but one helpful way to define it for me has been that it's the idea that Judaism is and ought to be focused on where we live right now, rather than having Israel be a central focus. We'll share some more background soon, but we also wanted to mention that Alissa Wise and Andrue Kahn are co-teaching an upcoming class in Judaism Unbound's Yeshiva. The class is entitled Jewish Diasporisms, Approaches to Nation, Home, and Responsibility, and it begins in just a few days after this episode is released. It begins on Tuesday, March 18th. So don't wait to register. If you're intrigued by today's conversation, head right over to judaismunbound.com/classes. When the podcast ends, or even in the middle, you can just pause the audio and go over there and sign up and come right back. But you can sign up on that website and also learn about all the other awesome classes being offered in the Yeshiva this semester. They all begin next week. So this is the last reminder you're going to hear on the podcast before the classes have started. So you should head over there and explore all the classes that are available and sign up for one or a bunch of them today. And we also want to let you know that you can apply for financial aid. We don't want costs to be a barrier. So if you need financial aid, there's a link to apply for it on the registration page for every Yeshiva class. And so now a little bit more introduction for our guest today. Alissa Wise is an organizational consultant, community organizer, educator, rabbi, and ritual leader with over 2 decades of movement building experience. While studying to become a rabbi, she worked on the West Bank with the International Women's Peace Service and as education director at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York City. She co-founded the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council in 2010 and went on to become a staff leader at Jewish Voice for Peace from 2011 to 2021, serving as organizing director, deputy director, and co-executive director. She's currently the lead organizer of Rabbis for Ceasefire, which she founded in October of 2023. She is the co-author with Rebecca Vilkemerson of Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing. Alissa Wise has rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Our second guest, Andrue Kahn, serves as the executive director of the American Council for Judaism. Previously, they served as associate rabbi at Congregation Emmanuel of the City of New York until 2023, and then served as the associate director of Yachad and Adult Education at Congregation Beth Elohim in Park Slope, Brooklyn. His edited volume, The Sacred Earth, Jewish Perspectives on Our Planet, was published in June 2023. Andrue Kahn spent a year studying at Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba and Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then received an MA in Religion and Modernity at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and an MA in Hebrew Bible from the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan. Andrue Kahn received rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. So without further ado, Alissa Wise, Andrue Kahn, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
So fun.
Well, I'm really interested in the sort of aftermath of the times that we've been in for the last year plus, in the sense that I was really struck when I was looking at the Rabbis for Ceasefire website at just how many rabbis had signed it and how many people whose names I recognized and didn't think of as extreme leftists. And I might be wrong. Maybe they were, but I don't know.
It's like 400 or something now, right? Just to get the number.
It was a huge number, and really I was struck by some of the names. And I guess that tells you that if you have a certain kind of name, it actually has a big impact to sign something. But what really also struck me was that I know from so many other experiences that there are a lot of people that agree with any given letter that don't sign on to it for all kinds of reasons. So if 400 people signed on almost, you can imagine that there's a lot. And that doesn't sit with the description of the world that we hear a lot, that quote unquote really good Jews or real Jews are on one side of this, and the people on the other side are not good Jews in some fashion. And I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of the last person to say because rabbis think something, that means it's kosher. But in the world that thinks that, you have to have a different point of view, I think, when you see a ton of rabbis on one side of an issue and a ton of rabbis on the other side of the issue. That's a different description of reality than all the rabbis are on one side of the issue and it's only, bad Jews that are on the other side of the issue. I'm really thinking about, okay, what does it look like to have a Jewish community? Like, what is the Jewish community, I guess, in America that we aspire to in terms of its relationship to Israel or in other ways? In a world that recognizes that the stories that we've understood about who's on which side of the issue over the past year are not really what has been described by a lot of the people doing the describing.
So I think that what we're seeing and what you're naming is a much, much longer trajectory than just the past year. And I think that what we're seeing right now is, to quote Malcolm X, chickens coming home to roost. There have been a lot of folks out here, Alissa, one of them, who has been saying that this was coming. This kind of reckoning in the Jewish community has been brewing, since the 1940s. Two books that came out in the past year, Jeffrey Levin's Our Palestine Question and Marjorie Feld's Threshold of Dissent, make it very clear that this idea that is like that you're articulating, that's the main thing that you'll hear from organizations like the AJC or the ADL or movement organizations, that this is the way that the Jewish people are and what we believe. And
AJC being the American Jewish Committee and ADL being the Anti-Defamation League.
To try to make this claim that there's a unified Jewish take on anything, and especially on Zionism and Israel, that has never been true because of the nature of Israel's turn towards the right that, started in the 70s and has only gone further in that direction. And its kind of culmination in this moment, that the ability to maintain that consensus because Israel stopped caring about maintaining the cover that so many American Jewish organizations could point to as no, Israel's not doing these things. You can't say that anymore. It's very clear now. And so now that people that maybe many years ago would have more publicly agreed with folks that were paving the path to be able to speak out, had that repression not existed for so long and had that cover not existed for so long, they would have been out way long ago. But now we can get 400 folks ish saying yeah, this is wrong because Israel stopped trying to hide it.
I'm interested in this question of what this moment means about the rabbinic coalition that we've been able to put together at Rabbis for Ceasefire, because I myself, even as the founder of it, was shocked at its growth and size, and I would not have anticipated that in this moment, this would be when so many people would speak out and go against the grain of the mainstream on Israel. But then when I say that, I also understand that at the same time, this is the exact moment, right? It's like this paradox of both being the hardest moment and the most essential moment, right? So what does it mean to be a rabbi in 2023 when we started, right? Part of what a lot of us have gotten back in touch with is that when we signed up to be a rabbi, what we signed up to do was to take spiritual and ethical and cultural care of Jewish people. And so if that's your starting place, a moment like October 7th is a moment where you really are forced to think, what is my obligation in this time, right? It kind of calls the question where there might have been debates and definitely so much repression or just a chilling effect on critique of Israel because a lot of the major donors to Jewish organizations require silence or consent around Israel in order to maintain funding. But when you have a moment as intense and as raw as October 7th was. And in the immediate aftermath, hearing from Israel's military and governmental leadership their intention to destroy the people of Gaza, right? That was immediately what happened after. So there was, for many of us, a moment of clarity that Jewish tradition teaches life. Even if you might have identified as a Zionist or whatever beforehand, you fundamentally had to enter that moment with a fresh perspective and ask, what does Judaism teach us? What does my rabbinic responsibility call me to? The idea that pulverizing Gaza contradicted the core values of Judaism and challenged us as rabbis to, initially the idea was call Jews into the ceasefire movement, right? And that any kind of way forward was not going to be through bombs, but through diplomacy. The Jewish world right now, in one way, is like unrecognizable from October 6th, right? Not just on the left, but also on the right. Hillel International had their conference where Christians United for Israel had a booth and was an official sponsor where Rabbis for we didn't try to, but there's no way they would have given us booth to Rabbis for Ceasefire, or if not now, or Jewish Voice for Peace, right?
And just for context for people who don't know, Christians United for Israel is not only a Christian, I mean, obviously by the name, it's an organization that is Christians who identify as pro-Israel. It is by any measure a very far right-wing project that includes some pretty heinous rhetoric from those who founded it around what sort of the purpose of Jews being in that land is and our eventual sort of collective destruction for the sake of Christian sovereignty.
You put that very diplomatically. I would have said it much, like Christians United for Israel is fundamentally a anti-Semitic project. They understand that the purpose of Israel and their support for Israel is to hasten the second coming of the Messiah, at which point Jews must convert en masse or burn. There's literally nothing more anti-Semitic than that. Their ideology is Christian nationalist, steeped in anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, and closely aligned with the right wing and Trump. And you have Hillel, the campus organization, welcoming, encouraging them to bring their message to their participants at their conference. You have the ADL almost coming as close as one could come to endorsing the Trump presidency and looking forward to allying with them, right? So this is a moment where, and we've been saying this from the beginning, where one is being forced to choose a side. I think that there's a case to be made that it's actually a perfect moment for the rabbinic leadership to guide Jews in figuring out which side they want to be on.
So I actually wanted to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, Alissa, because it struck me also when I was reading the letter that all these rabbis signed on to. And you just mentioned it again, which is all these beautiful quotes that, again, they stir my heart about how Judaism should be an elixir of life, or how you should live by these words, and I think Rashi says, and not die by them, and things like that, right? But I think it's also pretty clear for those of us who have read various Jewish sources that there's lots of other quotes in the Bible and in the Talmud that, to give the most charitable read, are about at least protecting yourself, right? So if somebody, there's a quote, for example, if somebody is coming to kill you, you should rise up earlier and kill them, right? And these are quotes from the Bible too. And I'm wondering, just as a rabbi, is what you were saying in that letter that this is what Judaism is? Or is what you were saying in this letter that this is what we want Judaism to be moving forward? That we are trying to create essentially a contemporary version of Judaism that will be more fundamentally grounded in those ideas about love of the stranger, and that is a more attractive form of Judaism for the times that we live in and we're going forward? Or would you make the claim that no, this is really what Judaism is and always has been? And I guess my question is, in a way, how would you kind of express your message to people who really are are on the other side, but the reason why they're on the other side is largely because they're afraid, largely because they have a sense that there are people out there that do hate Jews and that do want to kill Jews. I mean, maybe including Christians United for Israel, but that there are people out there on all political sides that don't really like Jews and that say, that sort of view is a little bit too not self-protective enough.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say I would never say this is what Judaism is, right? Part of what I protect about Judaism is its multivocality, and that throughout Jewish history and Jewish time, there have been clusters of Jews around the globe that have made meaning of our ancestral heritage in different ways. So I would never make any kind of essentialist claim. I more am saying we get to choose what we pull from, right? Because it is such a multivocal tradition. So we can make the choice to pull the thread of life out of Judaism, and I want to make that choice. And part of the reason I want to make that choice is related to the second part of what you just laid out, which is, what you described about the fear that people have. Like, you're describing my upbringing and my family. My family are all very committed Zionists still, right? And I'm the black sheep, as it were, of the family. So I have that perspective deeply ingrained in me. And I grew up at a Jewish day school that brought me up largely on a diet of Holocaust in Israel, right? And the primary message that I got from that education was Jews are fundamentally alone in the world. And the lesson of the Holocaust was that the world turned their backs on the Jews. And so we only can depend on ourselves. That was a truly terrifying idea, especially I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I went to a Jewish day school with 10 other kids, right? It wasn't like I was in an environment, I wasn't in New York City and some kind of bustling Jewish metropolis, right? And part of what I was trying to heal within myself through becoming a rabbi is wrestling with or answering that question of Jewish isolation. And what I learned is that I actually feel so much safer when I have relationships of solidarity and camaraderie with people across lines of difference, right? Whether it's faith or race or class, and in particular through building those relationships with Palestinians. In my own life experience, I have learned there's multiple ways to work with that fear. I found a path to me that feels like a more durable way to ensure Jewish safety. I've come to understand since October 7th, obviously I've been doing a lot of soul searching, both because of the rifts with my family that have only intensified. I mean, these rifts are old with me and my family, but they've intensified. And I've come to really understand how I truly am living a Jewish life truly in the spirit and intention that my family instilled in me, minus the Zionism, right? They were raising me to be a caretaker of Jewish tradition and Jewish life. And I have internalized that and taken on that responsibility. I do this, yes, because I believe Palestinians should have freedom and Jews should not be occupying, dispossessing them. But I also do it because I want there to be a Jewish tradition that still speaks to generations after me, and that I understand that my family, my own personal family, did the work of caretaking Judaism when it would have been easier. They would have had a better life if they would have converted to Christianity, right? If they would have abandoned it. And they didn't do that. And I'm not going to do that.
On the Rabbis for Ceasefire front, I want to continue a thread of our podcast that we've been wrestling with for a long time, and that I personally just spend a lot of my life overanalyzing to an unhealthy degree, which is what's the purpose of a rabbi and what aren't the purposes of a rabbi, and what's the purpose of a bunch of rabbis together saying or doing anything. And I'm asking that it comes off cynically, because I think it is, but also I'm genuinely asking that as not only the cynical side, what happens, what is the work of a bunch of rabbis together doing something on a political issue or anything? Because I will tell you, I don't enjoy it that much. I do it. I find that in our political landscape, there are certain things that one does pragmatically or practically because people are inhabiting whatever assumptions they have, and you have to work with those and sort of try to move. So like people inhabit the assumption that rabbis are kind of number one level knowledgeable Jews, number one level exemplars of what Judaism is. And so when you have a bunch of rabbis say a thing, it comes off to people as, Judaism authentically says something. Whereas a bunch of Jews saying something that are not necessarily rabbis, it doesn't hit the same way. I think it should hit the same way. I actually don't think the voices of 400 rabbis more accurately distill Judaism at a given moment than 400 whatever Jews. And so I'm just sort of wrestling with that. And a lot of the people, even what Dan said, I mean, there are people on the left that come into things like Rabbis for Ceasefire, including folks like me that have these kinds of critiques of authority and of centering certain kinds of established mouthpieces as having the wisdom of a community. I mean, for a lot of us, if there were like some secular petition of like, here's a bunch of PhDs, like we reached out to a bunch of people with PhDs to sign on to a thing, a lot of folks on the left would be like, well, that's a specific reflection of a specific set of people, and we actually need the voices of others. Now, we're part of an ecology, and there are other organizations that are not just rabbis that do amazing work on all these fronts. But I'm kind of curious how you'd respond to that, because there's a part of me that worries that there's like room sometimes for almost like the way that people critique the academy or the elites or whatever. Like, there's a way that you can actually take rabbis from certain Jewish perspectives as like, oh, they're actually deeply a specific kind of Jew and not reflective of everyone. Even as you can also say, well, these are people that are steeped in Jewish tradition and can speak to it. So like, am I way too into this nonsense? Or is this a worthwhile something to consider? What's going on with like Rabbis for Ceasefire as opposed to, or in partnership with Jews, people for ceasefire? Rabbis are people.
What is the role of the rabbi when the community that they are representing and leading no longer believes in binding halakha, right? Like that's ultimately what you're coming down to, because that was the original role of the rabbi prior to modernity, was that this is the person and still in the Orthodox world. This is the person that tells you how to live your Jewish life in a kosher way, and you got to do what they say to be part of the community. And if you're not doing it right, you either got to do tshuva or you're out. Mm-hmm. But both Alissa and I represent forms of Judaism where, and you too, Lex, like where that's not what the role of a rabbi is. And the role of the rabbi then becomes a big question. I think that it is often multi-layered. We've got a ton of organized power and money claiming to speak on behalf of Jews from a like hierarchical system where like these are the people that like say this is what Jews think, and being able to organize rabbis as a voice of power to counteract that is inherently powerful. I mean, we've also got multiple rabbinic organizations representing rabbis of various denominations claiming to speak on behalf of all rabbis. So unless there are rabbis who publicly speak out in dissent to those narratives when they don't agree with them, everyone will just say, oh, that's what rabbis think. There's another layer that I think is extremely important, and I just hear this from people all the time, where there are lay Jews that will reach out to me just like on social media or via email or something, saying, thank you so much for representing the Judaism that I want to be a part of. If there aren't leaders representing the kind of Judaism that Alissa was describing before and Dan was asking about before, very publicly and without caveat in a coherent ethical way, then there's no one for lay people who are searching for guidance to turn to. And so being very publicly outspoken about how our views are rooted in Judaism, and we come to our views not just as progressive or left or liberal Americans, but as rabbis with grounding in traditional Jewish text and belief and thought, that is a powerful thing, not just to like make change in the world, but so that Jews who feel otherwise alienated from the Jewish institutional world feel like they have representation amongst Jewish leadership.
I think about this question a lot of like the role of the rabbi today, because I think a lot of it is modeled after Christianity, honestly, right? Christian hegemony is a big way that rabbis in our time have come to model this role. Like it's almost unrecognizable, right? As Andy was saying, of the role that rabbis played in previous generations. there's been a rabbi in every generation of my family. I'm my generation's rabbi, right? So my way of being a rabbi would be like completely not just illegitimate, but also not recognizable to my to my ancestors, I would imagine, right? And one of the things that I think I struggle with, Lex, along the lines that you do as well, is on the one hand, I resent the way that assimilation and Christian hegemony has molded Jewish community in a way where rabbis are often put in a role, at least in liberal Jewish communities, of being the ones who practice Judaism on behalf of, or are knowledgeable of Judaism on behalf of. Part of what I think is happening now actually is proliferating in the Jewish left is anti-assimilationist in the sense that we are trying to bring Torah back to the people, right? So that there is a level of learnedness in the Jewish world, right? So we, in order to transform the role of rabbi, we also have to transform the learning that happens for Amcha, right? For the people. I've been having a lot of conversations, like people call me to ask about, should I go to rabbinical school? Should I not? And when I interrogate, and when I'm like in a conversation with someone who's kind of distilling for themselves, like, why do they want to be a rabbi? A lot of it is they just want to do the learning. They're not necessarily interested in the role. They're not necessarily interested in being a figurehead. They're interested in being deeply immersed, right? And so in a model of Jewish living where everyone is engaged in study, where everyone has access to the tradition, rabbis actually are pretty useless in that world. Like we are like what are we for? The only thing you need rabbis for is to make another rabbi. Like you don't need a rabbi to perform weddings or even conversions or a lot of the things where like rabbis are in these roles. Like traditionally that hasn't been the role of the rabbi. But I want to put that in contradiction to this other way of being rabbi in this time, where one of the things I was so shocked about at the high holidays, Rabbis for Ceasefire did a mass public yizkor, which is the traditional Jewish service of remembrance, on Yom Kippur afternoon. And one of the things I was so surprised by is the kahal, the community that came together there, included some of the most staunchly secularist New Yorkers that I have encountered. I used to be an organizer at Jews for Racial Economic Justice. And a lot of them are red diaper babies who helped me understand how secular Jewishness is a thing, right? And they eschewed rabbinic authority. And yet they came to this yizkor with tears in their eyes, right? And told me afterwards, like, Rabbis for Ceasefire is the only thing giving me hope in this time. Like people who don't go to shul, don't pursue rabbinic pastoral care, don't even, probably before this moment, didn't even realize that it mattered to them, the role of rabbi, saying that like in this time, one of the things that's been the biggest light for them is Rabbis for Ceasefire. We have to kind of like own that even as we try to transform the world to like redeem parts of Jewish living pre-modernity or pre-assimilation or kind of bring it into this new phase, we also have to own that like we are signing on to having that moral power. And it is not just to put our names on statements to try to influence policymakers. It's also a huge reflection to the Jewish community that the people who are the most steeped in Jewish tradition and thinking constantly about the health and sustenance and durability of Jewish community are calling for ceasefire.
Yeah. So I have good news for our listeners, which is that the two of you don't only work with rabbis. I would love to turn to some of the other efforts that you're both participants in or sort of visioning. Some of these are future tense. And there's two that I'm thinking of in particular, one for each of you. Andy, you are in the midst of something that I find really fascinating and also like complicated, which is revitalizing, refreshing, renewing, whatever reverb you want to grab, doing that set of reverbs to an organization that was founded in the mid-20th century. That's super interesting to me, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that. It's not a rabbinic organization. It's not just for rabbis. And Alissa, you are doing some thinking with rabbis, with many people who are not just rabbis, about movement building, and particularly movement building revolving around a term that has grown a lot in the last decade or so, diasporism. And so I'd love to hear about those two efforts that are not just about what rabbis can be and do and stand for, but also what Amcha, which you said, Alissa, I love that, what the people can be up to.
So the American Council for Judaism was founded in 1942 at a major turning point in the Jewish world internationally and the American Jewish world in particular, and a turning point that I think is coming to a head right now. Prior to this moment, prior to the 1940s, for the vast majority of American Jews, an anti-Zionist stance was assumed and was the norm. There was this general sense that Judaism was a religion, or that Jews, even if you weren't a religious Jew, if you were a secular Jew, the Jews belonged wherever they were, and that there was no need to try to go back to somewhere else because we were citizens where we were. And this was a wonderful development from the Enlightenment that started with emancipation in Europe and that kind of continued in America to a great degree. And the American Council for Judaism, the ACJ, was responding initially to the beginning of the American Jewish establishment, turning towards accepting a Zionist point of view in which Jews are a nation akin to Germans being a nation or the French being a nation, and that therefore Jews needed a nation state akin to the German nation state and the French nation state. And the ACJ was like, wait, hold your horses. Like, the founding document of Jewish reform in America says explicitly that we are not a nation and we do not strive to be a nation.
And we'll throw that in the show notes for people who want to look. The Pittsburgh Platform is what Andy is referring to.
Of 1885, because there was like a second one in the 90s. So the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform says very explicitly, we no longer seek a return to Palestine. We are members of the nations where we are, and Judaism is a religious tradition that guides us towards an ethical way of being that should improve wherever we are. In attempting to maintain this primary narrative of American Judaism at the time, a whole bunch of rabbis and also lay leaders basically got tarnished about a decade later with being insufficiently empathetic to the plight of European Jews. There was this idea that Zionism cared about saving Jews from the Holocaust, and therefore the ACJ didn't, because they were saying, actually, we're not Zionist, and we believe that building a Jewish ethno-state in Palestine is going to create significantly more problems than it's going to solve. But this was where the ACJ started. And at its height in the 60s, it had something like 20,000 members. And over the course of time, because of the normalization of the Zionist viewpoint in both the Jewish institutional world, but I would say more importantly, in the non-Jewish world, the ACJ fell out of favor. Over the past 7 or 8 months, I have been working with a team of lay leaders who grew up deeply seated in the reform movement, who have been incredibly disappointed in the reform movement's response to this moment, refusing to call for a ceasefire, of refusing to call for an arms embargo to push for that ceasefire, of refusing to actually create an environment in the synagogues in this movement, and even beyond the movement, where Jews who dissent can still feel like they have a spiritual or cultural home. And we've been working on revisioning what this institution may accomplish today in a world where there are lots and lots of American Jews who desperately want Jewish community beyond the political, something that grounds them in some kind of religious, spiritual, or cultural tradition that doesn't require of them an adherence to Jewish nationalism that implicitly or explicitly supports genocide in Gaza, or the expansion into the West Bank and Syria, or the other actions that Israel is taking that the institutions that purport to speak on behalf of Jews are just allowing to pass without really full-throatedly saying this is not a representation of the Judaism we believe in. And so a big part of the goal really is to figure out ways to put the Judaism back in the hands of the individuals that need Judaism. rather than continuing to build upon this foundational sense that every Jew needs a rabbi to teach them, to lead them, to officiate for everything. To start showing Jews, and especially Reform Jews, because by and large, Reform Jews end up growing up in situations where they don't get the tools to like lead services or know what it even means to like facilitate Jewish life on their own, because the structures really do point people towards rabbis to do that for them. But to show Reform Jews even who may not even have strong Hebrew, like that's okay. You don't need to. There are plenty of ways to lead a Jewish community without having to capitulate to these authority structures that don't represent you.
I'm really curious. I mean, there's a way in thinking about this conversation where, and correct me if this isn't a good analysis, but where we think about diasporism, for example, it makes me think about like, okay, so what we're talking about here is a form of Judaism that kind of is like, we're kind of used to it in the sense that for a long time, there has been conversation about, oh, well, you all say that Judaism is a religion, but I actually don't believe in God. And so can I really be a Jew? And everyone's like, yeah, you could totally be a Jew. There are all kinds of ways to be a Jew if you don't believe in God. And there seems to be in, not recent years, that for many decades, a kind of reversal in a way that people, it's pretty unobjectionable to say that you can be a Jew and not believe in God. But it's unfathomable to say that you can be a Jew and not believe in Zionism. And I actually have traveled the journey of having an increasingly complicated idea of what God means, such that I feel like we probably shouldn't exclude any kind of Jew because, among other things, people can change. I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit a vision for what Judaism, what to be a Jew might look like. Actually, this might be hard for you because I'm curious about the person who is both an atheist and a non-Zionist, right? In the sense, because the American Council for Judaism is offering, as I understand it, kind of a religious vision of Judaism as an alternative, right? It's saying, oh, Judaism is not an ethnic thing, it's a religious thing. And I'm like, no, that doesn't appeal to me. I don't want it to be a religious thing either. I'm looking for something else. And it's kind of like, are you going to excommunicate me? No, but what I'm curious about is if you could articulate what it would mean to be Jewish in the future, or what it could mean to be Jewish in the future. By the way, parenthetically, I think the really good thing about 400 rabbis signing on to any letter is that I don't think that the rabbis can tell you what Judaism is, but I actually think there's a pretty powerful statement when they tell you what it isn't. Because I think people assume that if rabbis say that Judaism isn't X, then it's hard to say that it definitely is. But anyway, I'm curious if you could just put out there sort of a vision of what that version of Judaism would look like. And also, and I think a lot of people have questions about this, which is in a Judaism that, let's say, tolerates and accepts non-Zionism, anti-Zionism as part of the span of how to be Jewish in the world, people are afraid that that means that we have within our body of fellow Jews people who sort of wish ill upon our fellow Jews who are living in Israel. And I don't think that that's what most people imagine, but I don't think that we've had a good articulation of how do we imagine a future where there can be Jews who profoundly don't feel connected, don't even approve of the idea that there should be a Jewish nation state, and yet understand that there's millions and millions of fellow Jews that live there and don't wish ill upon them and do feel that they want them to be safe. So what does that look like? Because I think it would be very wonderful to have a really great articulation of that.
Well, the diasporism movement that Lex was asking about earlier actually is one answer to that. My read of Judaism, right, as a tradition, and this is how I've come to understand it, and this is very informed by my being trained up as a Reconstructionist rabbi, right, is a tradition that has continually been changing and evolving over time and has looked different ways across the globe throughout Jewish history. And that relates to the other fundamental piece of how I understand Judaism, which is that it's a tradition that was created by and for the experience of diaspora and exile, right? So by my reading, we could talk about Israelite religion in Torah. But when we talk about Judaism, as it has evolved, is a rabbinic tradition that really began in exile, right? There was never a formal edict of exile after the destruction of the Second Temple. And many people who are Jews were in historic Palestine. But Judaism as a tradition was by and for diaspora and exile. And that's what the project of the Talmud and the rabbis was like, how do we adapt land-based practices to being fundamentally mobile and being able to be transported? And so now we're in this moment where, the most unprecedented thing about the moment we're living in Jewish history is the amount of political and military power that Jews have, right? That is the thing that's like the most novel about this time. We need to fundamentally be re-engaging with what does it mean to be Jewish in this time, and how do we wrestle with the kind of power that Jews have that we've never had before. One version, a movement of Judaism that explicitly centers, or what I would say like recenters diasporism, is this idea that throughout Jewish time, Jews have lived in communities throughout the world that have, in some cases, been exposed to hardship and oppression perpetually, right? And that narrative has really become dominant in the way that we narrate Jewish history. But the truth is that there's actually been a multiplicity of ways that Jews have taken root around the world. And so part of the vision of a diasporist movement is that we can embrace diaspora and use it as an inspiration to nourish where we are, not dominate it. Over the past couple decades, Jews have been taking up that project. Part of the project that I'm interested in doing now is, can we kind of bring ourselves together? All these myriad projects and organizations that have been trying to figure out how to live in right relationship. There's a process of healing from ancestral trauma that's part of that. And this includes those that are living in Israel now. It's kind of painful how remote it feels in that part of the world to imagine living in harmony with one's neighbors, right? Like it existed. My family was part of it. My family moved to Palestine in 1809 from Lithuania, and for many decades lived in harmony with their neighbors there. I think it could happen once again, but I think fundamentally what we're aiming for is Jewish communities that retain their diversity, right? And their multivocalness. And that we have it here in Philadelphia. We have 3 chavurot or minyanim or synagogues that are non-Zionist. There's the Labor Bund is emerging here. There are Mizrahi and Sephardi cultural networks that are popping up. And all of those are in deep relationship with partners on the ground here in Philly that are Black organizers, Muslim organizers, and spiritual communities. So I think that we want to nourish relationships on the local level to deepen our connection to Jewish history and tradition. That's kind of what I picture.
What is the ongoing relationship between the Jews who live in Israel and the Jews who live in other places in this vision, or for the people who are not Zionists? Because one thing that you could say is like, yeah, I'm just not interested in that. And I think I actually think that is the right of Jews. That if they want to say, I want to have a Judaism that really is not related to Israel, there are people who will say that's wrong, that for all kinds of reasons. But from my perspective, it's like, okay, so you say that's just not my kind of Judaism. In the same way that, like, I don't really have much relationship with ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's just not part of my Judaism. And that's one option. But another option, though, is to say that it is part of my Judaism. It's really important to me to articulate that I'm not for this. But I think that the question that puzzles a lot of people who are invested in Israel is like, okay, but then what's the vision for that? Like, in other words, like you were saying, Alissa, it's like we can imagine and pray that one day there will be peace and harmony again. But in the meantime, what do we do? And I'm not asking what should Israel do from a policy standpoint. That's not our topic of this podcast. That's not our topic probably. And like Lex was saying earlier, that may not be the right province for rabbis. But what I'm saying is, in a world where this conflict in Israel is present and doesn't seem to be going away, then it feels like a lot of the solutions that are sort of proposed, whether that's a two-state solution or a one-state solution, none of them is really workable in the short term and doesn't really seem to be what the parties that live there are interested in for the most part. I guess the question is, where does that leave us here outside of Israel and saying, like, okay, so how am I supposed to relate to this situation and to the fact that half or so of the Jews live there?
This is raising the question of this idea of like, all Israel, all Jews are responsible for one another, right? Like that's a kind of an idea in Jewish thought, but I think it has always remained an idea. It's never been a reality, right? I think like part of being a diasporic people means that there have always been Jews living around the world in different ways and in different levels of relationship and connection to one another. And I've always balked against the idea of that, of like we're one spiritual unit. It just hasn't ever resonated with me as a lived reality. There's always been so many different ways that Jews have lived and practiced. But I also want to say that it feels important in this that we are careful about the conflation that happens, that I feel like I'm even guilty of Judaism and Zionism, right? So it's like the things that are tying people together in the world is like an allegiance to Israel maintaining Jewish supremacy in that land and those who oppose that vision, right? And that is not the same thing as being linked to one another through ancestral language and text and culture and practice. We're still too much in it, right? I think it's just so hard because every single moment, right, we're in a tussle with those that want to synonymize Zionism and Judaism, those of us that want to insist that we are able to practice Judaism, completely separate from it, but then we're always referencing it. We're always like in relationship to it, right? And so it's too hard to properly disentangle Zionism as a political movement and Judaism as a religious and cultural tradition.
So Dan, I think your question brings up the assumption that Israel needs to be a Jewish ethno-state in order for Jews to be safe living there is a false assumption. And to say that isn't new, right? There was like a Jewish party led by Judah Magnus and Martin Buber and Henrietta Jold called Ehud, who were calling for a binational state from the get-go because they thought that would be a safer way for Jews to be living in Palestine. Both Palestinians and Jews have like full rights. To me, of course, it's really important that Israelis are physically safe where they are. I don't think currently that the state as it is actually does a great job of creating situations in which Israelis are safe. I actually think the Jewish nation state puts Jews that live there significantly at risk. I care about those people. I care about Palestinians at this moment in the grand scheme of my understanding of Judaism. And Alissa quoted a Talmudic text, this idea of Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bezeh. Every member of Bnei Yisrael, of the people of Israel, are responsible for each other. This gets brought out a lot in the way that folks try to frame and conflate Zionism and Judaism, the context of where that text comes in the Talmud. What it's saying is that everybody within Bnei Yisrael is responsible for rebuking each other when they're doing something wrong. It means that we are responsible for when we see another Jew doing something wrong, we have to tell them that they're doing something wrong. And we have to try to keep them from doing that thing that's wrong. And so I would say the kind of tradition we are coming at, criticizing the state of Israel and its behaviors, actually represents Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bezeh significantly more clearly than the folks who are using that text to say that they have to support Israel at all costs. And to have a perspective that there shouldn't be a Jewish ethno-state also doesn't say that like the land there is not important. Of course, there is a historic connection to that land. There always has been. And there were Palestinian Jews living in Palestine prior to the state of Israel. But that also doesn't require a Jewish ethno-state, and certainly doesn't require the oppression of the other peoples living there. The Jewish cultural response I would give is that Israeli as a mode of Judaism is a very new mode of Judaism. And there are like all of these very interesting cultural creations that have come out of Israel, of a place where people are speaking Hebrew, creating new art. It's another form of Jewish practice and tradition. And like Alissa was saying before, throughout history, there has always been many, many modes of being Jewish happening simultaneously all over the world. And being Israeli is one of those. Unfortunately, the state that Israelis are living under are also doing things that I think are anathema to the way that I understand Judaism. But that doesn't mean that I don't care about Israelis. I care about all people, and I'm fascinated by all modes of Judaism that exist all over the world. Like you were saying, Dan, like there are ultra-Orthodox Jews living a few blocks from me, because I live in Brooklyn, who certainly would say I'm not a rabbi. And my mom converted conservative, so they'd probably say I'm not even Jewish. And I've had even modern Orthodox rabbis say, well, if you wanted to study at my yeshiva, you'd have to convert first. What do we have in common? I don't know, other than the fact that we live by the Jewish calendar and that we study Torah and like believe that Judaism is something to be taken seriously. And I want to go back to your original question too about Judaism as a religion. So the idea of Judaism as a religion is an advent of Christian hegemony. The category of religion is one that came out of modernity and the Protestantization of society. Judaism has always been this like crazy blend of all kinds of different things. And Moses Mendelssohn in Germany tried to articulate, he was the first one to try to articulate Judaism as a religion as part of the method of becoming emancipated in Europe. And so that language of Judaism as a religion speaks to a lot of people and is helpful to understand what Judaism is for a lot of people. It also alienates a lot of people who are atheist or opposed to organized religion because of the harms it's caused. Judaism has things within it that have been framed as religion. Judaism has a lot within it that busts the boundaries of religion entirely and shows that Judaism is something significantly more than religion. I don't have a single word for what Judaism is. And I also don't think there's a single Judaism, right? There's all kinds of different Judaisms out there.
I always chuckle when Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh B'Zeh is used, that text about all Jews being responsible for one another. It's a fascinating sentence linguistically, and I think we don't notice it. And it's actually specifically fascinating politically, because if you type in Kol Yisrael Aravim into Google Translate, I just tested this, without Zeh B'Zeh. If you type in Kol Yisrael Aravim, the response will be, all Israel are Arabs. The word Aravim, which is translated as sort of responsible for one another, is also the word for Arabs. It also is the word Erev Rav, like a mixed up something. So the idea, I would translate it, if I were trying to be most specific, I would say all of the people of Israel are mixed up with one another. All of us are intertwined with one another. I actually don't think all Israel are responsible for one another is exactly what it means. I think it means we're in like a trail mix together. We're bundled all up and like connected in some way. I don't know that it automatically means that we have certain, I mean, I do think we have certain responsibilities, but I would just bring that in, because if you translated it as all Israel are Arabs, that would actually make this set of conversations very interesting. And
can I say something to that real quick? Just that, like, the mixed up piece is exactly it. Because right before that, it's saying that if you know another Jew is doing something wrong and you don't do something about it, you're in trouble too. So it's this idea that, and God is going to mix us up. God doesn't see the differences between us. It's that, like, if one of us does something wrong, we're all getting the lash, right?
Yeah. It's also the root for evening, like the time that's sort of mixed up between day and night. Like there's so much with this root that we could play around with. So the closing question I have, I mean, I want to reflect on what you said really quickly on, there's 3 local chavaras or synagogues or whatever in Philly that are not Zionists. I think that's not just about Philly. That's about more and more the entire country that the 4 of us live in. It's also happening in other countries, and like the growth not only of opinion shifting, but of communities being brought together around that is important. And I want to bring it up because in the established set of Jewish institutions, their world, there's all this talk about the quote unquote surge. There's all these articles about the surge and how October 7th happened and all these Jews were so revved up to go to synagogues and classic Jewish mainstream institution. And like, there's also been a surge of other Jewish organizing and Jewish efforts. I learn about a new Chavurah founded by a bunch of non-Zionists like every other day at this point. Like there's one here in Providence that has arisen in the past year. There's 3 others in New England that we're in touch with trying to do stuff that have all emerged in the last at least like 3 years. Like this is happening. This is a surge. Yeah. And so I wanted to close on that note because it actually ties back full circle to where we started. It's not only that hundreds of rabbis are signing on, this is already filtering out into the global and national Jewish community. So can you give us a little bit of that side of things? Maybe it'll end us hopeful.
All these Havurot, all these Minyanim, they're like being put together by people in their spare time, right? This is like a grassroots movement of people who have to work and have jobs and like have lives to live that are very difficult already given the circumstances that most folks are living in America today. And still they are finding time and energy to organize their community for Jewish life. People are amazing in doing that. And they desperately need support in organizing and in connecting with each other and in figuring out how to make sure that they're working together in such a way that they're not spending the little energy they have and doing the same stuff. And so one of the things that I'm working on right now is organizing in New York the folks who are doing this kind of work, because I, as in the role that I'm in, like it makes sense for me to spend my professional time doing that. And they all have other jobs they have to do, right? And the goal would be that moving forward, the ACJ would be able to work within the diaspora Jewish movement to help do that around the country so that they're not spinning their wheels in ways that are unnecessary. And that God willing, going forward, we can also help to bring them the resources they need to do this in a way that is significantly more manageable than scrambling in their spare time to make this stuff happen, which is just I really want to lift up how wild that is, that people that have so many life responsibilities are also spending so much time organizing this kind of Jewish life for themselves and their neighbors. It's incredible.
Well, this is the whole idea about the new movement. Part of the new movement of Judaism rooted in diasporism is about ensuring that we have a consolidation of all of the energy and the power that's building, that's rooted around a life-affirming approach to Jewish life. And just to say that I think it's important to note that it is not just a religious phenomenon, right? Like the new movement that we're going to be standing up, God willing, is going to be holistic in its approach, right? There is going to be the synagogues and rabbis and chavurot and minyanim, but there's also going to be the like cultural work, right? Like the poets and the novelists and the essayists and the Judaica makers. There's people who are making their own tefillin, right? They're like, it's like kind of like, you can't like the kind of like explosion of diasporous Jewish life building. You know, I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful about the Jewish future. And it's going to take a lot of work and effort, both to have enough political power, right? I'm thinking about having enough political power at the end of these next 4 years of under Trump that we could be able to claim at the end of those 4 years a minimum of 18% of the American Jewish community as part of the Jewish left, would be a little bit over 1 million people. That would amount to a significant amount of new political power, but then also cultural power, right? That a lot of these formations would be at a level of maturity and sophistication and relationship with one another that it really is viable. You know, one of the things I'm really focused on is making Jewish life outside of Zionism and in diaspora so compelling, right? That it's not just for the people who are already aligned politically, but that those who are still part of institutions, however tangentially, that are Zionist, like the Judaism that we build is so compelling and enlivening, they'll join us just because of that, not necessarily because of political alignment. So here's to building that future.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Thank you so much. So fun.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again with us in the future, especially in our coming weeks as we round out this unit exploring American Jewish discourse on Israel-Palestine. Before we close out, we want to remind you, don't hesitate. Head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes, where you can sign up for this amazing course taught by Alissa Wise and Andy Kahn called Jewish Diasporism's Approaches to Nation, Home, and Responsibility. It is going to be so awesome, and you can also, at that same link, learn about our other classes that are beginning this coming week. Don't wait. Now is the time. When you hear the next Judaism Unbound episode next Friday, these classes will have already started. So head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes and also apply for financial aid. It is still available. It's always available for our classes. And there are links in all of the different registration pages so that you can apply. As we close, we also want to encourage you to be in touch with us, which we have been so deeply appreciating throughout this unit of episodes and always appreciate. So you can be in touch via our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. You can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all our other episodes, and all sorts of other goodies. And we're really deeply grateful when you are able to support us financially at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.